So ending our discussion on the Phillips curve and introducing a discussion about the business cycle, we now introduce a discussion about different types of theory, macroeconomic theory, about why the business cycle, why we end up with what we've got here. We've already spoken, or I've given you a whole lot of explanations about how the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, why the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts, why the aggregate demand curve shifts, right? We've had this discussion as we've gone along. But in that discussion, there's kind of like, I've just taken a whole lot of different parts from different theories to say why these things do this. So what I'm just going to kind of clarify here quickly then is, what are the different theories about these things shifting? So you've heard it all before, but it'll just be which theory says what about why these things shift is essentially what we're going to talk about now. And again, you know, in terms of the question you might get from it, don't expect anything complicated, if anything at all. Okay? But definitely expect something. Just don't expect anything too complicated. So if we talk about the mainstream business cycle theory, in other words, what the kind of general consensus is about why the business cycle happens, about how all these movements happen, what do we end up with? Well, potential GDP tends to grow, and it seems to grow at a fairly steady rate. Aggregate demand, however, tends to fluctuate quite a lot more. Okay? Because the money wage rate is sticky, if aggregate demand grows faster than potential GDP, what tends to happen is that real GDP moves above potential GDP, and we end up with an inflationary gap. In other words, we end up moving from, say, point B to point D. So we end up with some inflation, and we've moved above potential. Alternatively, if aggregate demand grows slower than potential, then real GDP moves below potential GDP, and we might end up with a recessionary gap. Okay? In other words, when we are below potential. If aggregate demand decreases, real GDP also decreases in a recession, and this mainstream theory comes from there's a number of different theories within the mainstream theory. Okay? And so there's the Keynesian story, there's the monetarist story, there's a new classical story, and then the new Keynesian story. Okay? And we're kind of going in chronological order here. So first you had the Keynesian cycle theory. And you would still have people who would say that this is what they think the main reason that we have business cycles is. But this was the sort of the main story that was, I don't know, in the 40s and 50s, I guess, right? Which said, you have fluctuations in investment, which are driven by fluctuations in business confidence. In other words, animal spirits, it's all about expectations. The business cycle is primarily about expectations, and it's primarily on the business side of things, right? So you have entrepreneurs who are continuously making decisions, and making decisions about expecting, or let's say making predictions about what they think is going to happen in the future, and investing based on those theories. So that was referred to as the animal spirits. So the Keynesian business cycle story says that it goes up and down and fluctuates like that because it represents basically animal spirits. Investors are driven by greed, and they are driven by fear. Those are the animal spirits. And it's greed when it's going up, and it's fear when it's going down. Then you had the monetarists in the sort of 50s, 60s, and they're saying, yeah, there are fluctuations in investment, but there's also fluctuations in consumption. And these fluctuations are driven primarily by money supply issues. If you have erratic money or erratic monetary policy, so erratic money supply, some kind of a monetary policy that's all over the place and changing constantly, and sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, you know, interest rates are going all over the place. If you've got an erratic monetary policy, that is what the monetarists would say is the reason that we have this erratic cycle. It goes up and down because money supply is continuously going up and down. You want to get rid of business cycles, get rid of erratic money supply. So you can see there's a different emphasis. They're saying, yes, there's investment and consumption fluctuations, but why are there those fluctuations? Not because of animal spirits, but because of money, control of money supply. Okay? That's the monetary story. Then you had the new classical guys. So remember that Keynesian story came in response to the classical story. The classical story was everything adjusts, and everything adjusts pretty quickly, so we never move away from full employment. Okay? Which is not a very good description of what we actually have in real life. So after the Keynesians have had their say, and after the monetarists have had their say, you get the new classical guys. And the new classical guys say, look, it is as we say, everyone has rational expectations about what's going to be happening to prices. Okay? And the rational expectation of that price level is determined both by the supply side, what is our potential GDP, as well as what we expect aggregate demand to be doing. So there's expectations about aggregate demand. And those determine the money wage rate and the position of the short-run aggregate supply curve. And it's only if there are unexpected fluctuations in aggregate demand that you end up with expectations of inflation not corresponding to actual inflation. And it's that causes the fluctuations. So they're saying, yes, okay, you might have erratic money supply. Okay, you might have animal spirits, right? In other words, people making decisions that are sometimes driven by fear or sometimes by overconfidence. But in fact, it's minimal. There's not a lot of that, right? Because people are primarily rational. So if there's an erratic money supply, then the reason that you have an erratic business cycle is because it messes with people's expectations of prices. And because it messes with people's expectations, they can't make accurate predictions about what inflation is going to be, right? And so you have this continuous mismatch between an expectation and reality in inflation. So it's not so much that people are driven by fear and greed and all these things, or even if they are, that's fine. The reason that they get their guesses wrong is because there was a mismatch with unexpected fluctuations. Okay? And then you get the new Keynesians who come back in response to the new classical, because obviously if you had classical, then you had Keynesian. If you have new classical, you're going to have new Keynesian. The same response, basically. Same argument, which says, okay, look, maybe you guys are right. It is, people do make rational expectations, and it is the case that when there are unexpected fluctuations in aggregate demand, that we end up with these fluctuations in the business cycle. But what makes those fluctuations so dramatic, or what makes them last for a long time, or what makes us move away from real GDP for a long time, is the fact that money wages are negotiated in the past in some period, and then they get fixed, right? In other words, we have sticky wages. And because we have sticky wages, we end up moving away from the long run production, the long run level of output. So you can see that all of these stories here are, little bits of these stories are all reflected in the mainstream story that we told here, which is kind of the story we've been telling throughout building all the way up to chapter 28 and now in chapter 29. It's kind of a culmination of a little bit of all of these things. So as a question that you could get, you could expect maybe, what is the business cycle driven by in Keynesian theory, and then some options, and then one of them would be animal spirits, right? You get what I mean? Something simple like that. Now, you have the mainstream business cycle theory, which is kind of, as I say, what we would understand as the reasons for business cycles now. And you might call it a new Keynesian. The most recent would be essentially a new Keynesian DSGE, which the DSGE stands for Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium. So new Keynesian fancy model, right, for explaining business cycles. But before you had the new Keynesian fancy model, the new Keynesian fancy model is based on the real business cycle theory, And the real business cycle theory is basically a classical story, which was the 1980s. So it's the real business cycle theory kind of corresponds to this. And then the most recent kind of understandings of business cycle would be this one, new Keynesian stuff. But how does the new classical cycle theory look as a more kind of fleshed out kind of theory, I guess? Well, you had the real business cycle theory of the 1980s, and it basically says the reason that things go up and down like this, ding, 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 is because you have unexpected changes in technology, unexpected changes in productivity. In other words, you don't know when the next technological breakthrough is going to come. It happens kind of randomly. And because it looks random, when we look at our GDP growth also looks quite random. New advance in technology. No new advances in technology. Advance in technology, right? No new advances in technology. So when the new Keynesian guys say that there are unexpected fluctuations in when the new classical guys say there are unexpected fluctuations in aggregate demand, why are they unexpected? Because you have these unexpected changes in technology. You don't know when technology is going to change. When is the next breakthrough in, I don't know, flying cars? I don't know. But when it happens, there'll be massive changes to the economy. When do we suddenly, stop the telomeres on your DNA shortening and then your life basically goes on forever? I don't know. But when it happens, there will be changes in the economy. And that's the sort of the new classical story. It looks random because changes in technology are random. And that's what drives growth. Sorry, where are we now? And then we can talk more about this theory, but there's not... Yeah, you can just read it in the textbook. There's not really much I can add to it that I haven't already in our discussions. Cool. Any questions about the business cycle theory stuff? It's a lot of reading. Okay? Are you happy that we move on then to the next chapter? No? Yes? Yeah, we're done with this one. The end of the chapter, as I say, is just like a whole long story about these different types of business cycle theories, which we've kind of already discussed. Well, actually, what we've discussed extensively, and it's just a case of putting them into different boxes. Okay. Anyway, as I say, we're on a tight schedule here. We will do examples of that chapter 29 stuff and examples of this chapter 30 stuff next week. Okay. So before the test, we'll work through our issues. Okay. Yeah. So fiscal policy now. We've moved on to Chapter 30. And the thing about Chapter 30 and the fiscal policy discussion is we've kind of already spoken a lot about this. We know something at this stage about what we mean by fiscal policy. We're just going to dig a little bit deeper. So after studying this chapter, what are we going to do? Describe the national budget process. So we're going to talk more about the budget, as well as look at the recent history of expenditure, tax revenues, etc., except that the diagram in the slides is not particularly recent. So I'll just go online quickly and show you the most recent data, which is quite easy to find. And then we'll also look, so what we haven't discussed at all so far is what are the supply side effects of fiscal policy? Remember, whenever we've spoken about fiscal policy, the primary kinds of fiscal policy action we've spoken about have been an increase in government spending that changes aggregate demand, right? Sorry, an increase or a decrease. Some change in government spending that changes aggregate demand, and a change in taxes which changes aggregate demand. But taxes also have supply side effects. So that's something new that we're going to introduce. Okay? And then the last point here, which is explain how fiscal stimulus is used to fight a recession. Well, I think we should already kind of know how that happens. Right? In our ASAD diagram, if we're in a recession, what do we want to do? We want to increase output. How do we increase output? We increase government spending. That shifts aggregate demand. Kicks us out of recession. So we'll just take a look at that as well. What is the national budget? Ultimately, it's an annual statement of the expenditures and receipts of government, together with the laws and the regulations that approve and support them. And there are two purposes. The budget serves two purposes. It's going to finance the national government programs and activities. In other words, whatever, social grants, things like that. And as well as to achieve macroeconomic objectives. In other words, you want to stimulate growth, fiscal policy can try and get involved in that, right? Okay. So the government programs and activities is more the kind of social side of things, as opposed to what are your, hard economic targets. Fiscal policy, it's made by the Minister of Finance. Yeah. And what does the Finance Minister do? The Minister of Finance proposes a budget to Parliament each February. And after Parliament has passed that budget, then the President either signs those acts into law or refers the bill back for revisions. And Parliament begins work on that budget with the Minister of Finance's... Parliament begins work on the budget with the Minister's proposal. In other words, the Minister will say how money can get spent. Parliament then takes that money to spend it, right? Well, I say takes, it doesn't take it, but basically the ministers of Parliament then go to their different departments and say, right, these are our budgets, this is what we're going to be achieving, let's start doing that. Okay. The Minister of Finance and National Treasury develop their own budget ideas in their respective budget committees. Cool. You can have a surplus or a deficit. We've come across these before. So you have ultimately your budget balance, and your budget balance is your revenues less your expenditures. So if revenues are greater than expenditure, if revenues exceed expenditure, then the government budget balance will be a budget surplus. If expenditures are greater than revenues, then the government has a budget balance, which is a budget deficit. And if the revenues are equal to expenditures, then the budget balance is a balanced budget. It's like a Dr. Seuss book then, right? Okay, a balanced budget, when your budget balance is balanced. Okay. Any questions? No. Oops, yeah. So if we then just go back quickly to our looking over here. So the latest figures we looked at were deficits of about 150 billion, right? So in 2012, okay, that's slightly better than what we were looking at in 2012, where we had nearly 200 billion. So maybe there's something positive there. Where does most of the money come from? Well, it comes from income taxes and taxes from profits on businesses. Where does most of our money go to? Current payments. Look at government spending on current payments versus government spending on transfers and subsidies. So this is essentially, social grants and stuff. So nearly 400 billion on social grants, but 560 billion on current payments. What does current payments include? Not things like infrastructure, because payments for capital and financial assets, this is basically government salaries, mostly. Remember, the government is basically the biggest employer in the country, I mean, as a single entity. So if you look at our budget surplus and our budget deficit over time, it's a fantastic story to tell, because first of all, we start here at the end of apartheid, and at the end of apartheid, first of all, the National Party was utterly useless at running a country apart from all their other ills. And expenditure was far greater than revenues. They had big deficit problems. So we have the transition to democracy in 94, the ANC takes over, and notice expenditure as a percentage of GDP starts falling, whilst revenue starts increasing. And this increase in revenue comes with increase in investment, increase in GDP growth. You know, things start looking pretty good after 1999, right? There has been an increase, but after 1999, GDP growth starts looking really good. And you can see after 2004, we start getting quite a lot of change in revenue. A lot of that has to do with who's in charge. Anyone know who was in charge of Treasury at that time? Sorry, not Treasury, SARS. Pravin Gordhan. So Gordhan moves into SARS, and there's a concerted effort to A, make people happy to pay their taxes, which sounds ridiculous, but it happened. People were happy to pay tax, well, you know, happier, let's say, to pay taxes. And SARS was good at collecting taxes. They put good systems into place, they brought good people in, and they made sure that if you owed money, you paid it, right? So tax collection starts increasing. This is 2009. Now, a number of things happened in 2009, but let's not all put this on domestic politics, let's say, right? So 2008, end of 2007, beginning of 2008, you have the financial crisis in the Western, well, let's say the developed economies, or a number of developed economies. The financial crisis of 2007, 2008, global recession. South Africa experiences part of that global recession. We don't escape it, right? So our economy goes down a bit, bloop. And this is also at the time that there's a change in leadership in our ruling party. Now, what I want to just bring to your attention here is, if you look here, when you look at revenue as a percentage of GDP and you look at expenditure as a percentage of GDP over this period, notice that as a percentage of GDP, government spending is around 33%. You happy with that? Government spending around 33%, revenues around 30%. Okay? If we go back 5 years before this, revenues, right, which are now close to 29%, at the beginning of 1994, around 22%, but expenditure was only around 28% of GDP. Expenditure has now accelerated up to around 33% of GDP. So if we extend this graph, what has happened as a percentage of GDP to government spending? Well, maybe not quite that dramatic, but let's say sort of like that. And revenues, which peaked at the end of Gordhan's period there, have sort of, I don't know exactly what the growth path is, but they've sort of matched like that, right? So we've just got this continued and sustained budget deficit. And whilst the budget deficit value itself is not increasing, as a percentage of GDP, it's increasing, which means government spending is becoming more like a bigger and bigger component of total GDP, which is not sustainable, right? So there are worrying, let's say, devils in that detail. This was fun to watch. So during this period here, notice that our revenues are slightly bigger than our expenditures. We were actually running a budget surplus. Trevor Manuel was in charge at that time, and Cosatu was giving him a lot of hell. They were like, we are a developing economy, we've got high unemployment, and you're running a budget surplus. This is outrageous. And we can go back onto the internet if you want. You can go look at their documentation. They're fantastic. Cosatu's got a very Marxist philosophy. And part of the Marxist philosophy is when you write a pamphlet, it sounds like something written by North Koreans. There's a lot of emotive language, and there's a lot of big dramatic words being thrown around about who knows. Anyway, so you read their documents, it's fantastic. And they're basically saying that Trevor Manuel must go. He's a what do you call it? Like a traitor to the revolution, right? And Trevor Manuel's response was, look, our economy is growing, okay, but we also have inflation at the upper bands, right? His argument was there's very little room for government to increase expenditure now without causing problems on the inflation side of things, and bearing in mind that we are in, he said, I think, a boom time, right? And what do you do during the good times? You build up a reserve, so that in the bad times, you know, it's like, what's it, David and his Technicolor Dreamcoat in the Bible and all that business, right? You have your 7 good years, and then you have your 7 bad years. Your 7 good years, you store up your grain in your silos, right? So that was Trevor Manuel's story, and Cosatu was like, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about. And then 2007 comes, and look at that change. If we had already been in a deficit, this change would have been massive. Note that after 2007, 2008, you don't hear anything from Cosatu anymore about, oh, we were wrong. Maybe that was a good idea. No. Politics is fun game. Yeah. Okay. Well, when you're on the sidelines, it's a fun game. I suspect that when you're involved, it's pretty rubbish. So what is our budget? If we consider what this looks like, revenues 1991 to 2012, taxes on income and profits versus domestic taxes versus other taxes, that trend continues if we extend it to 2017. It looks pretty much the same. When you look at expenditures, however, current payments, you can see that they went down. This was Trevor Manuel cutting down expenditure by government, okay, but increasing social grants. What has happened post 2012? Well, this has continued up, and this has gone up, but not as much. And here's our payments for capital and assets and stuff. Yeah. So we have a very trigger-happy government, happy to spend on current goods and services. It's just like that student with her 14 million, right? What do? You don't buy a house, you throw a party, right? You buy the best shoes you can. That is just a reflection of government right now. And then again, we can look at, and it's quite fun if you're interested in these things, you can go look at the figures. I say fun. I use that in a very loose term, as a loose term. Maybe if you're going to be an accountant, anyone here accounting? Accounting, yeah, this will be super fun for you, bearing in mind that this is your life, right? This is what you will be spending 8 hours a day doing. If it's not fun, you're in the wrong profession, right? Looking at expenditures and revenues and things. So without spending then too much time on what those numbers are, and they're not important for the purposes of your test, or anything like that. So you can have a read of them and internalize them. If we then look at the supply side effects of fiscal policy, we know the potential GDP is full employment GDP. But remember, when government imposes the tax, and we've said like an income tax, we know that that has a demand side effect through consumption. Yeah? Remember, consumption is disposable income. You consume disposable income. You consume from your income after tax. So you increase taxes, there's a consumption effect. Okay? Now, apart from the demand side consumption effect, there is also a supply side labor effect. Why? Because remember, your income that you earn is after tax. So if taxes go up, that means effectively your income or the hourly wage rate that you earn has gone down. The hourly wage rate that you take home goes down if taxes go up. And what do we know happens when real wages go down? We supply less labor. Yeah? Okay. So there's going to be a supply side effect. The tax on labor income influences potential GDP and aggregate supply. How? By changing the full employment quantity of labor. Why? Well, the income tax weakens the incentives to work and drives a wedge between the take-home wage of workers and the cost of labor to firms. Right? So if we look at our labor market, here's our labor supply without any tax. Labor supply, no tax. Labor demand, and we're not worrying about tax on the labor demand side. So here's our labor supply. What this tells us, if we take any point, and we can take this example, this point here, at this wage rate, at a real wage rate of 200, we would supply a quantity of 20. Are you happy with that? Without any tax, if our real wage rate was 200 Rand, per hour, we would supply 20 billion hours of labor. Okay? Cool. If there was a tax, right, on our wage, what wage would we need to earn in order to take home 200 Rand an hour and therefore supply 20 hours? Well, it would have to be, if the value of the tax was 150, we would have to earn a wage of 350 to supply 20 and take home 200, right? And we can do the same exercise at any point along our supply curve. So when we add that tax, we're essentially shifting this labor supply curve up or to the left, however you want to think about that movement. Are you happy with that? It moves upwards or to the left. The entire labor supply curve, when you add a tax, shifts to the left. Okay? Which means, and I'm just going to take off my scribbles here quickly. If this was our initial full employment level of labor, with this quantity of labor, 25, being employed, once we add the tax, which shifts our labor supply curve to the left, what ends up happening? We have a new equilibrium quantity of labor, which is lower. So what happens to output? As our employment decreases, our output decreases. So the story here is that you impose an income tax, you can have a supply side effect, which is detrimental to output. So you impose a tax, you get smaller quantity of labor and lower potential GDP. Okay. remember, this only tells you the side of the story that is the supply side. If we're going to take this into a broader discussion about whether government should be taxing income or not, the point would be, okay, maybe we have a shift to the left, right? So we lower full employment. But if government takes that tax revenue and uses it in other ways that grow the economy, right, that increase the productivity of labor, that increase infrastructure, that increase political stability, for example, that would shift our labor demand to the right, which would then, once again, boost output. So the point of the story is, you tax income, it's bad for growth. That's right. What matters, therefore, is what do you do with those taxes? Right? That's the important question in the South African context. What is the South African government currently doing with those taxes? Well, we saw we had quite a good run where, in fact, there was a lot of transfer happening. That can be a good thing for growth as well. There are good reasons to transfer income for growth. We haven't discussed it, but there are. And cutting down on its current payments. Fantastic. Only thing that we would like to see then is maybe a little bit more investment in infrastructure. What have we seen instead? Increase in current payments, not as much increase in subsidies, and very little change in infrastructure expenditure. Which then makes people even less keen to pay taxes. And we can leave it there. If you've got any questions, come down. We can have a chat. Otherwise, we'll pick it up at this slide tomorrow. Just do a quick recap and then surge on ahead with the rest of chapter 30 and probably finish it tomorrow and maybe even start chapter 31. Yes. Okay, I will see you tomorrow. Thank you and enjoy.